Hi, welcome. My name is Elizabeth. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm really glad you're here. I have another true crime story for you that is difficult. This tragic story comes from the mishandling to the outright stupid mistakes made by the people in charge. The victim of the story was a 19-year-old college girl. It was 1996, and the campus police first, but quickly followed by the actual police, made a lot of poor choices. It was nearly 30 years ago, and we've learned a lot since then. We've learned that college campuses are not actually safe for young women. We've learned that while there are college infractions that police from the campus can deal with, actual crimes, should involve the police and should involve the police right away. But I'm pretty sure that in 1996 we knew that crime scenes should be preserved and searched. And I'm pretty sure that we knew that evidence was important and shouldn't be lost. This story about a 19-year-old girl who went missing from her college campus. She was seen 40 yards from her dorm where she was headed, and then never again. And even though there was only ever one suspect, the case wouldn't be solved for over 25 years. This story contains discussion of inappropriate sexual behavior directed towards dozens of women in all sorts of ways, as well as a missing and assumed murdered young woman. And I totally get if you're not up to that, so now is your chance to go ahead and click away and take care of yourself. However, if you're anything like me, you'll probably want to stick around for the ride. This is the story of Kristen Smart. Not to be confused with Elizabeth Smart, who went through her own harrowing and awful experience. This is about Kristen Smart. Now, she was born February 20th, 1977, in Bavaria, West Germany. But she was born an American citizen because she was born to two American citizens who were simply working overseas. Now, when she was a young child, her family consisting of her parents, Denise and Stan Smart, along with her two siblings, moved to Stockton, California. Kristen is described as a dreamer. She was strong, independent. She went her own way. Her sister says that she was never happier than when she was traveling. And by 19, she had already spent time in London. She'd done a summer in Venezuela as part of an exchange student program. And she had been a camp counselor in Hawaii. Now, originally, she had planned to attend UC Santa Barbara, but in the end, she chose to attend a university much closer to home. California Polytechnic State University, or Cal Poly for short. It is in St. Louis Obispo, and she was too late in signing up to get a dorm room on campus, but she put herself on the waiting list, and by Thanksgiving break, she was living on campus in a dorm room, and her parents could tell how happy she was to finally be there. Now, it doesn't mean that freshman year was by any means easy for Kristen. She often talked to her parents or wrote to her parents about wanting to drop out. She wanted to attend a school in Europe on a tropical island. School was hard for Kristen, and she often told her parents she wasn't sure she was going to make it through the year. Her parents would push her to remain at school and to finish out at least her freshman year. Now, all of this is extremely typical, but Memorial Weekend of Kristen's freshman year would leave the world changed for those who loved her. On Friday, May 24th, she called her parents and left a message that she had good news and she would be calling them and talking to them on Sunday. They had a standing Sunday night phone scheduled, and calling them on a Friday was a little unusual. Her parents have since learned that she was excited about a grade on a test. This would be the very last time that her parents would hear from her. That evening, she would go out with her dorm mates. She was her next door neighbor, and her name was Margarita. She would take nothing with her. So she didn't have her ID, she didn't have keys, she didn't have a wallet. She was relying on getting back into the dorm building with Margarita's key. Now, I know this sounds totally crazy, but back in 1996, dorm room doors were very rarely locked. I locked mine, but I actually went to school in a city. But if I went to visit someone down the hall or up a floor or down a few floors. I definitely didn't lock my door. It's actually a little crazy to think about now. Um, but my guess is that whatever outfit she had on didn't have pockets and she didn't want to be bothered with a purse. I mean, that's what 19-year-old brains do. They make silly decisions. But Cal Poly was known as a safe campus, but as Kristen's father puts it, it only takes one person to ruin your life. Okay, so Kristen's going out with her friend, and she has nothing on her, right? No ID, no money, nothing, right? On their way out of the dorm, they run into two other girls who are also headed out. And so all four of them decide that they are going to go out together. And they leave the dorm and they find a friend who has a truck and they ask him to drive them around and see if they can find an off campus party. Now, the party that they end up at turns out to be no more than like a couple of guys playing video games. And Kristen declares it a dud and they all leave. So they're back in the truck and they are now back to trying to find a party, but it's quiet because it's Memorial Day weekend and a lot of the kids have already finished out all of their classes and all of their finals. So they've already gone home for the year, for the summer. You know, they've already packed up and gone. So it's really pretty quiet. Now, eventually, Kristen asks that she and Margarita be dropped off so that the two can just sort of walk around and see if they can find a party. It was at this point that Margarita was no longer interested in looking for a party. The two had stood there and sort of in the street begging each other to do what the other wanted. Just come home with me. No, just come to this party with me. No, just come out with me. No, just stay home with me. Until eventually, both being, sure of what they wanted, they parted ways. Margarita would hand over her dorm key so that Kristen would be able to go back into the building later, and they headed off. Margarita says she has had to fight some guilt because of that, especially since Kristen was sort of angry and disappointed that she had decided to not continue on to try to find a party with her. So at a little after 10, less than a tenth of a mile from when she parted Margarita, she found a birthday party at a fraternity house. Now, I don't want you to picture a big fraternity house party like Animal House. This is not what's happening. Picture a small gathering of like less than 20 people. And few people would come in and out as the evening progressed, and eventually it would reach to about no more than, I think they said 40 or 45 at the most, at its biggest. Now, what happened at that party is still up for some speculation, and the reason for that is because the people in attendance have remained elusive about these details. The theory that most people ascribe to is that the most of the people in attendance were boys or young men who were members of the fraternity, and fraternities often have these codes of silence where if something has happened that could get them either kicked off campus or kicked out of the college, they just close their mouths and don't say anything. They just simply won't answer questions. It's a way to protect themselves. So that is probably why we don't have a lot of details about what actually happened at that party, but it doesn't sound like anything too strange or untoward. Now, at around 2 a.m., the party that Kristen had found ended, and a throng of college kids headed out into the night. Cheryl Anderson and Tim Davies, two students headed back to the dorms from the party, notice Kristen, and they notice her because she's lying on the neighbor's lawn. Tim manages to get her up onto her feet, and the pair tell her that she needs to go home, but it is clear that she is extremely inebriated. So Tim and Cheryl decide that they need to make sure that this poor girl gets home safe. And the sad thing is, if the details of who helped her ended there, she probably would have gotten home safe and had no more than maybe a bad hangover to complain about the next day. But another student would catch up to them by the name of Paul Flores. The walk was no more than half a mile back to the dorms. Kristen is getting help walking with Paul, who has an arm around her waist. Tim is the first one to peel off from the group. He had driven to campus, and he was now returning to his car. Next, Cheryl would head off in the direction of her dorm, simply because it was the next one geographically. It was the next one They were going to pass. She turns to Paul and says, please make sure that Kristen gets home safe to her. This girl gets home safe to her room. Now, I don't think that Cheryl knew either of these people very well. I think she was just being a good person. Paul and Kristen would reach Paul's dorm room first, and then he says he watched Kristen walk the remaining 40 yards to get into her dorm building. And please note that I said that is what Paul says happened. We really have absolutely no way of knowing for sure. Kristen's roommate wouldn't spend Friday night in their room, but she was back by Saturday, and she would notice that Kristen's things were spread all across her bed. It was a clear sign that Kristen had not slept in her bed the night before. Her roommate wasn't really worried until it was Sunday, and she still hadn't shown up, which was when she started asking around and found out that no one had actually seen her since Friday evening. So by Monday, the roommate, along with Margarita, the friend who had gone out with her on Friday, told a couple of the girls across the hall that Kristen hadn't been seen since Friday. All 4 girls decide that they need to call the campus police. And it's one of the girls from across the hall by the name of Jennifer that makes the call. Now, no report is filed. Campus police do not think that this is worthy of their attention because college kids have gone away for the holiday weekend, and that's probably just what it is. The girls would call a second time that day, and the campus police again said that she probably, if she wasn't somewhere with friends, and she was just at home for the weekend. So they actually did a little extra step and called the Smarts. Denise told them, Denise, this is the mom, would tell them that she had not heard from her daughter since Friday and that she had missed their weekly phone call the night before. Now, the Cal Poly police told Denise that she most likely went camping with some friends. She'd be back in a day or two at most and not to worry. Due to all of this, the missing person report wouldn't be filed until Tuesday, 4 days after Kristen went missing. Now, we've all seen or at least heard of the show 48 Hours. There's a very good reason it's called 48 Hours, because those first 2 days are critical. Critical. And not only did they miss the first 2, they missed the first 4. Isn't it better to look and find nothing than assume that there's nothing and not look? Let's get back to Kristen. Okay, so actually we're not going to get back to Kristen. We're going to get back to the person who was the last one to see Kristen, Paul Flores. Paul is a 5'10" freshman who grew up about 20 miles away from campus. He's awkward and he's a stutterer, and the more he drinks, the less he stutters. He's struggling with his grades. In fact, at this point, his GPA is a mere 0.6. The only class that he was passing that year was an elective in bowling. Now, the best resource that I have found for this story is a podcast. It goes by the name of In My Own Backyard. Now, it is hosted and authored by a man who was 8 years old when Kristen Smart went missing from his hometown. He grew up seeing her billboards on the side of the road his entire life and realized at some point that he didn't know anything that was going on. She was a big deal, and then her billboard stayed up, but so he decided that he was going to try to pull together as much information about this case as he could. And he was able to connect with people who knew Paul, not only at Cal Poly, but also people who knew him when he was younger and people who attended high school with him. And I gotta say, his reputation, not a good one. First, the women who knew him on campus said that they gave him a creepy vibe. In fact, many of them referred to him as Chester the Molester. That's not good. Now, he earned this title because of how often he would try to grope them or hit on them or was inappropriate with them. I mean, he didn't know how to be appropriate with women, and the women around him were well aware of it. When he was in high school, the girls at his school called him Scary Paul. Apparently there was another Paul in that same grade. So they had Paul, and then they had Scary Paul, and this was Scary Paul. The girls say that you all knew you did not ever leave any of your friends alone with him. He's described as the kid who is who is not invited to any of the parties, but somehow he always shows up and then often gets kicked out by the other teenagers because of how inappropriate he's being. Now, if this story was from 2 years ago instead of 1996, this guy would be an incel, most likely. There seems to be countless stories of women he's tried to forcefully kiss or grope without their permission. Even that night at the fraternity party, Tim, the older student who walked with Kristen after the party but peeled off to his car first from the group, he remembers that during the party he heard a loud noise, turned, and saw that this Paul person was on the floor on top of Kristen. And he just was like, oh, party shenanigans. But now that he's got some knowledge and some hindsight, he actually finds the memory rather disturbing. Now, think about that kind of person, that kind of predatory personality being responsible for a drunk girl by himself. Chances are he wasn't going to make the safe and healthy choices for that girl. There are several documented incidents involving Paul prior to that Memorial Day weekend. A group of girls had contacted the campus police because someone was on the trellis outside their window peeping in on them. The police showed up at around 1 a.m. and they found a very drunk Paul on the lawn in front of their house. They escorted Paul home. A couple of weeks later, he was stopped for driving under the influence, blew an alcohol level of, I think it was 3 times the legal limit, and as a consequence, he would end up having a suspended license. In March of that year, the campus police would receive another complaint from women who had been receiving prank calls for nearly 6 weeks. They told the authorities that they were pretty sure that the phone calls were coming from Paul Flores, which the campus police were actually inclined to agree with, as these women were the exact same women who had called about the man peeping into their room from the trellis. Now, this amazing podcaster is able to make, like I said, connections with people who knew Paul in high school. And he asked them, what did you think when you first heard about this story? And they all responded in the same way. I thought, well, I'm sure he did it. I'm sure he did something. I'm sure he's responsible. He would never miss the opportunity to take advantage of an intoxicated female. I, like a lot of us, can understand that feeling. I know when I found out about someone from my high school who is now on the sexual offenders registry, part of me thought, oh yeah, well, that's not surprising. I mean, it's creepy, but it's not really surprising. Many of the women who had had past experiences with Paul would say that while they had no specific knowledge, that they were absolutely sure that he was responsible for whatever happened to this poor girl. A co-worker in high school tells a very unsettling story about how all of them, they worked at a restaurant and they were all heading out. The restaurant was now closed and cleaned, and, the manager said, okay, good, everyone could go, and everyone's heading back to their cars. She's, messing with her keys and trying to get her key in the door and open it when Paul, who's already in his truck, jumps out of his truck, puts it in park, jumps out of his truck, runs up to her, puts his hands between her legs and gropes her crotch. Then he runs back to his truck laughing. I'm sorry, what? Why? So we've gathered that Paul's interactions with women are inappropriate at best, and in many cases, criminal. Speaking of criminal, it turns out that Paul was stopped another time while driving, but this time he was already had his license suspended. And because of that, he was expected to show up in court for an arraignment of those charges. But he didn't show up. Do you know what happens when you don't show up for court? Yeah, they issue a warrant for your arrest. That's how that works. So Paul was arrested on May 27th, 1996, just 2 days after Kristen went missing. And he is fully booked, including a mugshot. In the mugshot, it is perfectly clear that he has a black eye. He would give police 3 different stories about where that black eye came from. Oh, he just woke up with it. He doesn't know where it came from. And then he says, no, I hit my head on the steering wheel when I was adjusting the radio, which makes no logical sense because he lives in America, California, so in America, we drive on the left side of the car. So if he's in the driver's seat and he's adjusting the radio, he would hit the left side of his feet. That makes no logical sense. The third reason he gives was that it happened while he was playing basketball that morning. When they follow up with a witness, the witness says, oh, we played basketball, but it wasn't this morning. It was yesterday morning. And when he showed up, he already had the black eye. So that certainly didn't happen during the game. The police bring him back in for questioning on the 30th, and they notice that he has rug burn on his knee and scratches on the back of his hands. He blames the basketball game, which we now know is the wounds were already there. Police do not search Kristen's room until 11 days after she goes missing. Paul's room is not searched until 16 days after she's been missing. So over 2 weeks. Over 2 weeks, and the university has already cleaned and sanitized the room for new occupants. Okay, so now we're getting into some major mistakes made by authorities. The potential crime scene was not kept secure. In fact, it had been cleaned. And the police didn't ask for phone logs from the university until after the university had already purged all of that data. So we're at the part of the story where misogyny rears its ugly head. I mean, it may seem like misogyny has already reared its ugly head, and often does, but the incident report, composed by the campus police, is just dripping with misogyny. Keep in mind, it's 1996. Now, that's not an excuse. All that is a way to remind you what the zeitgeist of the time was. The report says that the victim attended a party and did not return after. In interviewing witnesses, he gathers the following. Kristen does not have close friends on campus. She had appeared to be intoxicated that night. She was seen socializing with many different male students. Tell me how you go to a party and you don't interact with many different students, be them male or female. Like, how do you go to a party and not do that? Like, isn't that sort of the point of a party? Okay, so this report is only talking about how she behaved, her conduct, no information about the way she was treated. And we really need to flip that thinking, okay? I'm not going to let this take me down another TED Talk road. We just need to flip the thinking. After 3.5 weeks of investigation, an officer reports to a student journalist that there is no evidence of a crime, and they're treating this case like a missing adult. Just another girl went missing. I mean, what's the big deal? I mean, she's 19. She's an adult. So what? So on June 26th, nearly a month after her disappearance, Cal Poly campus police finally handed over the case to the St. Louis Obispo police. Within 3 days, they had organized a search of Cal Poly campus with the aid of nearly 400 volunteers and the help of the California Rescue Dog Association. There's a link to this incredible organization below and a link to how you can donate. Their dogs are trained to alert at the scent of human remains. They are trained to detect over 424 different chemicals that the human body releases as it decomposes. So, it's the coolest thing ever. The dogs are awesome. So on June 29th, was when the dogs were able to be walked through each dorm by their handlers. First 2 buildings, all the dogs go through. Nobody reacts to anything. But then they go through a dorm building with a Labrador retriever named Sierra. She alerts to her handler outside the dorm room number 128. Serena is then taken out of the building, and Chala, who happens to be a border collie, is sent in with her handler. Now, the handler is not told that there was ever a reaction or an alert because they don't want to subconsciously alert the dog. So, handler has no idea. The dog and the handler are both completely cold for the experience. So now Chala also scratches at dorm room 128. So they send in a second border collie. This is Cirque. And he's brought into the hallway where he stops and he barks at room 128. Next, each dog is brought into the dorm room individually by themselves, and all three indicate the corner of the mattress on the left side of the room. And remember, this is after the university had the room cleaned. Okay, so next they remove the mattress and the box spring and from the dorm room, and they bring in a fourth dog, one that hasn't been here at all. This is a boxer named Tori. Tori alerts at the dorm room door, as well, just like the others. Then he indicates the same spot in the room where the others had, but the mattress is no longer there. So it's just in the air. He also indicates that he smells it on the corner of the bed frame, a garbage can, and the phone receiver. Now, these handlers are amazing. So they want to make sure that there is no chance of anyone saying something got messed up. So they just cover all their bases from all the different angles. So they take out all the garbage cans, well, enough garbage cans to line the hallway from throughout the building, and include the one that was in that room that Tori had signaled, and to see if he can spot that one again. And he goes right to it. Like, no question. That's the one. So whose dorm room is this? And more importantly, who slept on the left side of the room? I am sure you are shocked to find out it was Paul Flores. Authorities are able to confirm that Paul's roommate had already left for the summer, so Paul was the only one occupying the room Memorial Day weekend. And there's a couple of creepy pieces of information that they get from that roommate. Turns out that when the two spoke, Paul said that he had walked Kristen all the way to her dorm and then walked back to his own. Now, this might not sound significant, but I think it's interesting that he's got different versions of the story. Like, that doesn't, why would you have different versions, right? Then he made a very unpleasant and weird joke. You know that kind of joke that when you look back, it's not funny at all? Yeah, so the roommate had asked if he knew where Kristen was. Paul's response was, "Oh, she's at my house having lunch with my mom." Which is actually extra interesting when you add in the fact that when he was being interviewed by the police, about his black eye on the 30th, he cut the conversation short by saying he had somewhere he needed to be. And the police, of course, pushed him. The campus police pushed him. Well, where do you need to be? And he says, "Oh, no, I just need to go clean up some stuff." And they push him, "Where? Where do you need to clean up stuff?" He's like, I need to clean up some, I gotta go. "Where?" "I gotta clean up some concrete at my mom's house." I'm sorry, concrete? I'm sorry, concrete? I don't know about you, but for me, big flashing neon sign. The authorities would get a warrant to search the Flores' house. It was served 3 weeks later, on July 22nd, 1996. They they took very little from the house. They find a police baton hanging by the front door. It's seized simply because it's illegal for private citizens to own those. It's got nothing to do with the case. There are 3 different cutout articles about the Kristen Smart case. One is under Paul's father's bed, one is under Paul's bed, and one is on the refrigerator, as well as a receipt from Cal Poly indicating that Paul had resided in 128. Now, here's a really interesting piece of information. Paul's mother, Susan, was not living with them in that house. She was living in their rental property, and the police had known that she was living there. They probably would have searched that house as well. A house where some concrete flower beds had recently been poured. Remember how he said he had to clean up concrete at his mom's house? Yeah, this was missed. So the Flores family ends up putting that property back up for rent, and when they can't find renters, they lower the price near the end of September, and it was sort of like this um, perfect coincidence moment where there was a couple who had come to the street to visit one of their mom and had decided that they needed to move to the area to try to be close to the mom, and they needed to move in right away, and Susan lowered the price, and it just sort of all happened at once. So by October 1st, Mary and Joe had moved in with their 6-year-old daughter, and they loved it. The only strange thing about it was that sometimes they would get letters, or mostly postcards, asking them to have their son come forward and do the right thing. Now, they knew that this had nothing to do with them, so they ignored it. Then, one afternoon, Mary was washing her car in the driveway, as you do, and she noticed something on the driveway that's sort of shiny. And she picks it up and she sees that it's an earring. And upon closer inspection, she sees that there's something dark red or sort of rust colored. It's like a smudge. Maybe it's a fingerprint. And she decides to pick it up just by the little hook. And she brings it into her house and she puts it into a plastic bag and she seals the bag. And Mary worries that this might have something to do with the postcards they've been getting. She goes back to cleaning the car and gets distracted. I mean, she's got a 6-year-old. I'm sure she was distracted. A couple of weeks later, a police officer shows up at their door asking questions. The couple do not remember the officer's name, but Joe does describe him as big, bald, and scary. When they tell him about both the postcards and the earring, he tells them to hand them over, and they happily do. Meanwhile, Paul has been working at a service station in the area. Denise and Stan are at their absolute wits' end on getting, any information about what happened to their daughter, and they know that Paul is there, and they know that he was the last one to see her, so they just go. They just go to this service station and they walk in, and Denise introduces herself and Paul refuses to talk to her. He actually locks himself in the inner office at the station. He ends up quitting that job, and the Smarts hear that he's planning to enlist in the Navy. To keep him from leaving town, the Smarts lawyer presses civil charges against him. Now, meanwhile, the authorities truly believe that Paul Flores knows exactly what happened, but without a body, they can't be sure. And they don't want to move ahead too quickly. Not yet. DA wants a slam dunk. That's a quote from a movie too. If you know what it is, let me know below. The civil case allows for depositions, which can help in the fact-finding of the criminal case. It was discovered that the Smarts had never been notified about the existence of this earring that was found. Mary testified that it matched the necklace that Kristen is wearing in one of the many billboards that her family had put up all over town to keep her case in the public eye. The Smarts lawyer wanted the Smarts to look at the evidence so that they could give confirmation that it was actually one of hers. The Smarts tried to make appointments to come in to view this earring, this piece of evidence, but something always seemed to stop them. The police needed to reschedule, or they couldn't make it on the agreed upon time anymore, or what. A whole month goes by, and the Smarts are just like, we're done. So they get fed up, and they just show up at the station and say, show us the earring. And at that point, the police have to admit that they lost the earring. They lost it. They lost evidence. I don't understand. This might explain a little bit of it. Okay. Later, authorities would tell a local reporter that they never even marked it into evidence because they'd done what they referred to as a visual inspection and had determined that it could not have been something that could have been Kristen's, and so it was simply not kept. It was just not kept. There are a lot more details on this particular piece of evidence, but this is already going to be a pretty long upload. So make sure you check out that podcast. It's definitely below. The link to it is below for all kinds of details. Now, the other important piece of information that Mary and Joe had was this the cement that was laid for this flower box. It was not usable as a flower box because a second layer of cement had been poured on top, which made it so that the roots could never get to the soil. The soil was just too far away. And after the concrete was poured, every single morning, Mary would be woken up at the same time. Alarm from a watch that was going off, and it sounded like it came from her backyard. And for those of you who are young and have only ever had, like phones for alarms, your those digital watch alarms sounded like dee 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 dee. It's like a very specific sound. And it would go off for however long it would go off, a minute or two, or I don't honestly remember. And then it would stop, and that would be it. And apparently, every morning at 4:20, this watch alarm would go off, and her husband would go into the backyard and try to look around and try to find it and like poke around, and just they couldn't locate it for the life of them. Well, you might be curious as to why a teenager would have an alarm at 4:20 a.m. Now, Mary thought that it was a 420 devil's lettuce reference, which I can understand. College, that was a big thing, and I think by 97 that was a thing, right? Yeah, by then it was a thing. But hear me out. Hear me out. Kristen was a lifeguard, and the only shifts as a freshman that she could get were the ones that started at 5 or 6 a.m. We know this because she had written letters to her mother saying that that was one of the things that was making freshman year really stressful for her and making her feel really overwhelmed. So if your lifeguard shift starts at 5 a.m., you might very well set your alarm clock for 4:20. Now, eventually the alarm would stop going off in the mornings at 4:20, and that was probably most likely because the watch battery died. Mary and Joe would allow the authorities access to the property anytime they wanted, as is their right as residents of the house. The backyard was searched from the surface by a geologist who had never searched for human remains before. He reported feeling very troubled by the broken concrete in the backyard, the large dirt stain on the side of the house that indicated that there was probably a pile of dirt that sat there for quite some time. He also was upset by the splashes of dirt and mud on the fence, and he was not able to conclusively deny that human remains were there. In April of 1997, Mary and Joe moved out of the Flores' house, and Paul's mother moved back in. Now, the address of this house has been printed in newspapers, and it is well known who lives there. And starting here and continuing for the decades that she lived there, she would have to deal with a barrage of calls, letters, cards, messages, people standing on the sidewalk, people yelling, tell your son to do the right thing, come forward, tell the truth, those kinds of things. And she stayed for over 2 decades. She was protecting something, maybe? I don't know. Maybe. So the sheriff's office has not searched the home where Paul's mother had been living at the time. None of the vehicles of the Flores family. And they also lost, misplaced, threw away a key piece of evidence. But it wasn't until May of 1997 that they would make their worst mistake. They announced that the only way that they will be able to solve this crime is if Paul Flores gives them the information they know only he has. So basically, they show their hand. They say, okay, Paul, you have all of the power. And his attorney knows exactly what to do with that information. When Paul is finally deposed, he answers the question about his name, but every other question after that, he answers with, on the advice of my attorney, I refuse to answer that question under the Fifth Amendment, as is my right under the Constitution. He won't answer the question about what his father's name is. He won't answer the question about whether he attended Cal Poly. Nothing. It is so infuriating, but it is also very smart on the part of his lawyer. The authorities have already said that they have nothing. So if he says nothing, then they continue to have, say it with me, nothing. Kristen's case would never go cold. Never. They would always keep interviewing. They would always keep looking. They would always keep searching. I think at some point the number was in the thousands of Cal Poly students that had been interviewed. In July of 2000, the police pushed for a search warrant of the home of Susan Flores. And they provide an affidavit that explains that the evidence they have leads them to believe that Kristen Smart's body is buried in Susan's backyard. So this is the affidavit that they give to the judge, who says, okay, because of this, you can have the warrant to search Susan's backyard. They search for 9 hours. They search for 9 hours, but they don't dig at all. They don't dig anything. And the warrant stipulates that the moment they leave the property, the warrant is done. They cannot go back. They cannot search again. They cannot, nothing. This is their only chance to try to find something. And they don't find anything. And so it seems all the leads have been followed and didn't really lead anywhere. Now, an unlikely advocate for the Smart family would emerge by the name of Dennis. I wish I could get into everything with Dennis, but like I said, this is probably going to be a long upload as it is. I check the pod for more details, but there are some things that because of Dennis we know that I think are really important to include here. So one is that Dennis just kept pushing for an explanation as to why the backyard had not been dug up. He ends up talking to one of the police officers that was there, and he says, well, we took a vote and amongst the officers on whether we should dig up the yard or not. And we voted, and it came up that we decided, democratically, that it was just too expensive. I'm sorry, murder expense. Fine. Now, when Dennis would tell other people that the police officer said these things, the police officer would, of course, deny it. And he changes his story. He says, no, that vote was actually about whether we should fight for a second warrant, a warrant that would actually allow us to dig. Okay, so if this is the situation that they weren't allowed to dig, that they had to find something in order to get permission to dig, that's a different situation. But Dennis is not one to take someone at their word, which is awesome. Because Dennis decides he's going to follow up with the feds. And he gets a copy of the original warrant. And the original warrant totally allows for any digging. Any digging. Digging up all of the concrete would have been just fine. I don't understand. So another search would be carried out in Susan's backyard in 2007 using ground radar, but nothing was found. So you would think that that might be enough to get the Smarts to, sort of back down, but no. This family, Kristen Smart's family, refuses to give up. Now, talking about parents. Kristen's parents are amazing. Her brother and sister are amazing. They're supportive, they're kind, they're wonderful. You can tell that they love each other. Now, Paul's parents are interviewed for, they're disposed at one point, and they are interviewed and asked about what their son's involvement in this situation was. And if you're finding this interesting, I would highly suggest looking up the 48-hour special, which is, you don't have to look it up, it's linked below. The 48-hour special on Kristen Smart. Because there's footage of Susan and Ruben Flores being questioned, and Susan comes off as being so annoyed and aggravated. And she gives answers like, of course not, instead of simple no's, although she gives no's too, but those come off kind of obnoxious also. I think you can learn a lot about that woman from her demeanor during those questions. I find it very interesting. The father just seems to be trying to answer the questions as truthfully as possible without hurting his son, but she's got edge to her. But things would finally change for the better in 2001 when a new sheriff took over in the town. A man by the name of Ian Parkinson would take over for sheriff in the town, and he would make a promise to the Smarts family that he would either find or figure out what happened to their daughter, that he would do everything he could to try to solve that case, if possible. Now, what I find really refreshing about this wonderful man is that he admits that mistakes were made at the start of the investigation. Mistakes that all but crippled this investigation. Still, he's willing to go back, look through everything that they have, interview people again, search through things again, look at everything with, fresh eyes. He would actually reach out to the podcaster, which is awesome. I love when podcasters are a part of figuring out the crime. Because this podcaster had already done an extensive amount of research for this guy, right? So he gave over lots and lots of witnesses' names. And it's great. The podcaster, actually, he's interviewed for the 48 hours special. And he says, there were some names that they were like, oh, we don't want those. And then a couple of months later, they'd come back and be like, hey, can you get us in touch with those people? He's like, sure. So now it would take 10 years. Cold case, police work is not a quick thing. But it was in March of 2021 that a search of Ruben Flores' house was conducted. And it was April of 2021, so 1 month later, that Paul Flores and his father, Ruben Flores, would both be arrested. Paul would be arrested for the murder of Kristen Smart. Ruben Flores would be arrested for accessory after the fact. The authorities reported that they had located evidence of human remains in 2 different homes, and the remains were linked to Kristen. Specifically, human blood was found under the deck of Ruben's house. The trial is a whole nother story. The podcaster gives it a whole nother season. It's a whole nother story. But I really wanted to focus on sort of the crime. So I'm not going to go into any of the details of the trial, but the trial does take over a year and a half. It's not until October 18th, 2022, that Paul Flores is found guilty of the murder of Kristen Smart. Ruben Flores was acquitted. So on March 10th, 2023, Paul was sentenced to 25 years to life. I believe he was 44 when sentenced, which means that he will not even be eligible to ask for parole until he is nearly 70. Thank you for listening today. This was sort of a long one. If you have the time and the energy to give me a like or subscribe to my channel, it's super helpful to me and I really appreciate it. But otherwise, just do me a favor and be nice to yourself. A couple of ways to do that: get, more sleep, drink more water, but whatever you do, be nice to yourself. And I'll check you next time. Bye.